into some discussions. So with that, I'd like to welcome Richard Peter and Michael Garton into the discussion. Richard is the Indigenous Peoples Liaison for the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute. Richard has a long and storied career as a Paralympic athlete, as well as being an advocate for the lives of people living with spinal cord injury that have Indigenous heritage. And I'll let him explain a little bit more about himself as we move forward. And Michael Garton is a professor in the School of,
Biomedical Engineering.
Is the Institute of Biomedical Engineering, not the School of Biomedical Engineering, Institute at the University of Toronto. So welcome, Richard and Michael. And I was thinking that maybe just to get us started and open up this discussion, maybe if you could explain to the group today what injury you have, what level your injury is, and how it affects you in your day-to-day living. So Michael, I see you're there. Do you want to maybe jump in and go first?
Yeah, so I have my injury is between the C4 and C5 vertebra. And I actually learned from you, John, today that my injury is pretty rare because I actually do have a completely severed spinal cord. I didn't realize that was a very rare thing to have. And so, yeah, so I autonomic dysreflexia is something that is a big issue for me with that level of injury. And also it rang very, very strong bells when you talked about having hand function and so on as a much higher priority than walking. Because as a C4, C5 complete quadriplegic, I have zero hand function, which is probably the biggest impact of the injury.
Thanks, Michael. Richard, do you want to maybe provide some background on what kind of injury you sustained?
Yep, I can tell a bit more myself. So actually, I got injured as a T10. I'm a T10 incomplete injury, which I always say is down by your belly button. So right about there is sort of the level of where my injury happened. So sort of from the waist down. So a little bit different than from both John and Michael. So I've sort of got full hand function. Incomplete, mainly in that I've got sensation, so I can sort of feel. I always say about 80 to 90% of, let's say, my legs and so on. So that makes it a bit more helpful in regards to pressure injuries, as John was mentioned earlier too. I got injured, how many years ago now? Yeah, I guess that's the memory. That's how long it's been. I've been injured for about 42 years. And so I've gone through definitely a huge spectrum of, well, innovation and just the change of, easy one is, let's say, wheelchairs and cushions. And so there's many different changes that have evolved as I've been growing up also with the innovation of equipment. And so that's what I've definitely seen. And even just sport wise, I've seen that change. And so that's made many different impacts in my career. And so there's always, it's great programs like today that are bringing out new ideas and new concepts. And so that's always sort of the evolution as the SCI community. It's always great to stay on top of things, and that's one thing I always do now too, just with peer work and just helping. We always get things along by word of mouth, and with social media nowadays, that's great to find a lot more different programs and equipment and things that are happening in the SCI community.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. And just for you guys' information, I myself have a spinal cord injury as well. I was injured in a motor vehicle crash in 1993. I was just a young man. I was 16 years old. I was injured at the C6 and C7 levels. So Michael's injury, again, is sort of a higher cervical injury. Richard's is a lower thoracic injury, and mine's sort of mid-cervical. So my injury presents as a C7 incomplete. And it's kind of funny, I've got an incomplete injury as well. So one side of my body actually works quite well and the other one not so well. Almost similar to like when you would see somebody that has a stroke. So this hand here is sort of traditional C7, doesn't really work all that well. And this one here almost works as good as Richard's. Not quite, but pretty good. And it's kind of the same way down each side of my body. So my left leg works quite well and I can actually use it to stand up. My right leg, not so well. And it's funny because even though I have better movement on my left side, I actually have better sensation on my right side. So it's kind of strange the way that the damage to the spinal cord injury, the spinal cord, can affect your body in different ways. Anyway, so I think we all use a wheelchair as our primary mode of mobility. I think, Michael, you're using a powered wheelchair. Richard and myself are both in manual.
Yeah, I'm using a power chair.
Awesome. And in terms of independence, I'm able to live quite independently. I can transfer in and out of my chair and manage all my sort of activities of daily living independently. I know Richard is as well. Michael, I'm guessing transferring in and out of a wheelchair, with the fact that the height of your injury, you probably have no tricep function either, right? So I'm guessing that pushing up and weight shifting and transferring might be a challenge.
Yeah, so for me, I can't really assist at all in transfers, so I need full help doing that. So I would normally use a hoist to get in and out of bed and so on. But that can be, so that's, I'd say transferring is probably one of the biggest headaches for me, especially when it comes to things like traveling. So yeah, if anyone's interested in any projects in that area, that'd be great to discuss at some point.
Yeah, I guess it must make traveling really difficult when you need a lift to get yourself in and out of bed, or to do all those sorts of things. The simple act of going on vacation with your family or heading away to a conference for work becomes a bit more work, a bit more planning involved.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of planning involved. You typically need to rent a hoist, for instance, in the city that you're heading for, and that's not always possible. You can only usually do that probably in capital cities or places that are big vacation places. And then if you do end up getting stuck somewhere, this has happened to me a few times, where for whatever reason you're not able to travel to the next to a location where you can get a hoist, you're kind of stuck, and you've got to sort of try and find people, essentially just people in a hotel or off the street, to kind of give you a leg and a wing into bed, and it literally comes down to that. And so, yeah, having that there are a couple of supposed solutions to travel hoists out there, but they're so big and bulky and heavy that they're really not really practical for real traveling.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a van to carry it around, you basically need a van to carry it around with you.
Yeah, it's a lot. I know some of my friends, when they travel, they try to rent equipment and find care providers locally, but it can be a bit of a challenge. And you think about it, I think for a lot of people that are on the call today, the simple act of getting out of bed, you wouldn't even think of it being a challenge, but depending on the severity or the level of your spinal cord injury, that simple act can be something that's impossible to do independently. So maybe I'll move back a little bit, and I'll talk about our journeys and how we got here as individuals. So myself, I said I had my spinal cord injury when I was 16. I was quite young. I was still in high school, and in the end, I ended up going back to school and completed my high school. But at the same time, I was trying to maximize my recovery following my injury and ongoing rehabilitation. And following that, I ended up traveling overseas and trying out some different therapeutics and things like that, and different techniques to try to maximize my recovery. And I did quite well. I'm still using a wheelchair as my primary motivation or mode of transportation. So there was no magic wand out there, and there still isn't. And then when I got back home, I ended up going back to school and studied finance and international trade, and worked in global logistics for a while before pivoting into media, radio, and television. And about 6 years ago, an opportunity presented itself at the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute. Now, I didn't have any background or formal training in healthcare research, but it's always been a key area of interest of mine. It's been an area that I've followed quite deeply, I took this opportunity and really have grasped it with both hands. As you can see, the idea of patient-centered care and person-centered research and bringing lived experience into healthcare research, it's fairly novel, and we're really at the forefront of it. But when we think of innovation outside of healthcare research, it's actually quite common. you know, nobody's going to create a new iPhone or a new Tesla without doing really in-depth consumer review and you know, focus groups to try to make sure that the solution they're trying to develop meets the needs of their customers. But unfortunately, in healthcare research, it often happens in isolation from those that are intended to use it. So, you know, working at Praxis, my role really is to bring people with lived experience of spinal cord injury into the innovation space, into the healthcare research space. And I feel quite lucky to have this position. And that's sort of how I ended up where I am. Maybe Richard and Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got to where you're at currently?
Sure, I can jump in. And it's very similar as to, well, I guess slightly, and then also a bit different in that I got injured as a child. So that was definitely a big challenge for me and my family. And then also we grew up in a small town on Vancouver Island. And so that was, you know, it was hard to find a lot of this information. Like nowadays, you can jump online or jump on your phone and find some different devices and assistive programs and devices that can help you out. But for me, it was a lot more to do with, man, I guess word of mouth. And that was the big challenge that our community had to do a lot of adaptations as I'm going to the new school or going shopping or trying to go to the dentist. And so there's a lot of different changes that had to be, you know, adjusted there. But I think for me, it's also just life. If I said, all right, here, I wanted to get out and play sports, then that's one of the big things that you just sort of find out is just with life that, all right, now that I'm in a chair, I think the benefit of me getting injured as a young child, that as a child, you learn how to deal with, I guess, different obstacles and different issues that do arise. And so that problem solving is pretty, I'd say, sort of second nature or natural. And so that's what I've always grown up with, living in a chair, that I've always mainly problem solved all the time. And that's one of the biggest things is, all right, how can I get out and do this different program or activity? And that's one of the biggest things that I've always sort of grown up with. So once I did get involved into sports, even just with travel, as we just talked about now, that was one thing. And I said, all right, I need my first trip. I probably, as in everybody has, you bring a lot of different equipment with you to help you travel. But then once you go, then you figure out different ways. All right, maybe I don't need to carry this device, or maybe I can possibly rent it. And that's the big, you know, one of the biggest things is to figure all those differences out. For me, yeah, it's too bad. If I'd shown my first wheelchair of when I got injured, it was, I'll say, a 45, 40-pound wheelchair that you traditionally see in a hospital. And even with the cushion that I had was just a traditional regular foam cushion, 2-inch cushion. But nowadays, you know, with all the different changes, there are hundreds of chairs and different cushions that you can get nowadays. And so that has totally changed a lot of different benefits of just, you know, just quality of life, just to be able to, you know, the chair I have now is probably under 15 pounds. And so that makes a huge difference as to what's going on. And so I've always looked for different chairs, different equipment, different assistive devices that help you travel and do things. And so that's where it's always pretty easy for me to get out and share. And that's one of the big things too for me, that I've always worked within the SCI community, the Indigenous community, the sporting community. And so we're always sharing stories, as John talked about earlier too. When we sit down and get together, then we always talk about different things and different assistive devices or what's helped with quality of life. And so there's always a lot of sharing and a lot of communication and a lot of development. That's where a lot of these programs do. Let's say a new wheelchair. That's how some guys get together and say, we need to make this a little bit better. And that's how it does happen with some guys that do make it happen. And that's how I ended up here today.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I had my accident when I was 26. I was kind of on the cusp of becoming a full-time professional mountaineer expedition leader, and then I was climbing in Norway on my own on a big face called the Troll Wall. It's about just under a mile high vertical cliff face. And anyway, climbing that, I fell off and broke my neck and woke up in a couple of weeks later in hospital. And so I think probably one of the things to talk about that's relevant to today is that during my time in rehab, I was introduced because okay, I should say when I first kind of woke up in the hospital and realized and saw what had happened. I actually didn't know anyone with a spinal cord injury or any kind of severe disability. I had no real idea of what kind of life I was in for, and I had this perception that I would just be sort of stuck in the corner of a nursing home for the rest of my life, dribbling. But then in hospital, I was introduced to the occupational therapy department, which had a sort of tech room where they had computers with voice to text software, which was a fairly new thing at the time, and various ways of controlling the mouse, like you could have a little tiny joystick in your mouth, which when you sucked it or blew into it, it clicked and did various things. You had things that tracked your eye movement to use to control the mouse. And so from there, that kind of, it really opened up my eyes to what was possible and allowed me to think about what I was going to do after the injury in a bit more a positive and productive way. And so I decided to go to graduate. I had a degree in chemistry, so I decided to go to graduate school. And so 2 months after getting discharged, I went and started graduate school, doing a master's full time in computational chemistry, and worked through a PhD and a postdoctoral fellowship in Canada. And then a couple of years ago, I started my own research group in the University of Toronto. And so we don't do anything to do with spinal cord injuries. We do protein design for designing proteins for therapeutic purposes, and actually now moving into designing whole cells for therapeutic purposes. And I'm starting to see there may be an opportunity to move toward working on spinal cord injuries. We started working with stem cell people, but nothing as yet. And another thing I was going to mention was when I was back in the UK, I also had in addition to all these technologies that helped me get back into a full-time working life, I was from a very rural village in the middle of England, and all my kind of support network, friends and family were around that area. I didn't particularly want to move, like John was saying, into an urban centre away from them. But I needed to get into university every day, so in England I was able to get a fully adapted vehicle. It was a drive from wheelchair vehicle that you could drive into. It had no steering wheel; it just had joysticks. I have no hand functions, and my hands would just rest on these joysticks. And I could drive. It was an hour's commute every day, and basically, so it was a very advanced technology, and it allowed me to drive into work every day and actually, conduct a master's and PhD. And so I would say that if those kind of technologies and the computer technology and the driving technology wasn't available, I wouldn't have even been able to contemplate doing that kind of thing. It wouldn't be something I'd even consider. So I think that's one thing to think about is think about technologies which will open up new avenues for people in terms of what they're able to do for work and leisure. Would be maybe another interesting way to look at it. But that people with those disabilities may not even be thinking about, because you don't think about it if the technology is not available to do it. So yeah, okay. Well, I guess that's
right. That's a great segue, Michael. We're about to jump into breakout rooms where everybody on the call will be put into a breakout room where you'll have an individual living with spinal cord injury as your primary facilitator, so you can get into a little bit more depth about some of the ideas that you have and ask questions about what living with a spinal cord injury is like, or what innovations people have. But I do see we have a couple of questions from the group right now. So maybe before we jump into breakout rooms, maybe we'll ask these people to unmute themselves. So maybe we'll start with Sadaf Mosankani. I hope I didn't butcher that too bad, Sadaf. If you want to unmute yourself, and maybe you can ask your question, and we'll see if the group can answer that for you before we jump into breakout rooms.
Hi. I didn't have any questions, so I'm not sure if did I raise my hand by mistake?
You may have. Okay, well, that's okay.
Oh, sorry about that, everyone. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I do see Andrew, and I saw in the text Andrew's had a question he wanted to ask. Andrew Sacrani.
Yeah.
Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask what you have to ask?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I forgot who it was. Was it John, Michael, or Richard? I forgot which one it was. I'm sorry. But I was just curious when you were, 2 out of the 3 of you had mentioned that you had suffered a severe neck injury. And when you had suffered from that, what was the protocol of what any surgeon or physician or therapeutic provider had suggested to you for rehabilitation, out of curiosity?
Mhm. Well, maybe I'll go and field that from my perspective, and then Michael, if you've got something to add or if your experience was different. So I was injured in a remote part of British Columbia. Luckily enough, there were some nurses that were on the scene quite rapidly, and they helped to sort of immobilize me. And then from there, I was transported by first responders in an ambulance to a local tertiary hospital. And in that hospital, I was sort of stabilized and put into traction. I was then medevaced to Vancouver, to the specialist spine unit at the major trauma center there. And then I underwent a stabilization surgery where they open up the spinal column, try to, it's called a laminectomy, where they open up the area surrounding the spinal cord to try to relieve the pressure. And then they took some bone from another part of my body and used it along with some wires to fuse the vertebrae 6 and 7 together and stabilize them. I was then basically immobilized for about 5 or 6 weeks until they felt that the bones were stable enough for me to get up. And then I undertook acute rehabilitation, which is basically early stages of mobilization where you get up and you start to learn how to sit upright. And again, you know, this blood pressure modulation, which is affected by spinal cord injury, means that when you've been laying in bed for that long, you sit up, you suddenly have a loss of blood pressure, you get very dizzy, and it can be very unsettling. So it took a while just to simply be able to sit up in bed or to sit up in a wheelchair. Once I was able to withstand being upright for more than a few hours at a time, I was then transferred to the primary rehabilitation center here, Neuro Rehab Center. There's a bunch right across the country that we work as an organization very closely with. And from there, you know, we started learning activities of daily living. How do you dress yourself? How do you feed yourself? How do you bathe yourself? How do you operate a wheelchair or whatever mobility device you're going to use? Again, I was injured, you know, 27 years ago. So incomplete injuries were very rare. So the idea of getting me mobilized and upright and standing and walking really wasn't a primary concern for the rehabilitative therapists back then, because they didn't see a lot of injuries like mine. So for them, it was get me into a wheelchair, get me mobile, get me functional, get me independent, and get me out the door. I then continued on with some more extensive outpatient therapy and private therapy, trying to figure out if the wheelchair was going to be my primary mode of mobility or if I would be able to stand and walk on my own. In the end, the wheelchair became the most viable solution. But that was sort of the course that I took.
Okay.
Michael,
was yours similar?
Yes, I had quite a lot of extra complications because I think the conditions with which my injury happened was probably the worst possible conditions you could have. So I was basically stranded on a very remote mountain, hanging by a rope upside down, unconscious. And it was an extremely, the rescue crew, the helicopter rescue team told me it was the most dangerous rescue they've ever done. And they didn't put me on a spinal board. They just clipped the cable from the helicopter onto the back of my climbing harness, cut my climbing rope, and just flew the helicopter off with me sort of dangling below it, head of waving around in the breeze. And so you can't really imagine a much worse way to kind of be rescued, to be recovered. And I think because of the temperature was very low as well out in the mountains, so my temperature was like 25 degrees something. It was kind of barely alive. So I had a lot of additional complications, which meant that I was on life support for about 3 months after that. So one thing that did happen, apparently my heart stopped at some point and I had to be defibrillated 16 times before they could get it back going again. And I think that's whenever new doctors get my notes and see that, they're always absolutely shocked that happened. I think that's pretty unheard of. So because of all those extra things like the hypothermia, and I had to be injected with a lot of fluid, which made me kind of double in size. I don't quite know why that was necessary, but it was something to do with my temperature, I think. Like John, I had a piece of bone taken out of my hip, which was shaped into a vertebrae, I think, and pinned between C3 and C5.
Okay.
And so, yeah, what else to tell you? Yeah, I was in hospital for a year. I think I've heard that in Canada they tried to process people way faster than the UK. So they actually mentioned Canada when I was in the UK. They mentioned Canada as a sort of benchmark, they cited them as being a particularly rapid turnaround. But yeah, for tetraplegics, I think of my level, a year is actually quite normal, quite typical.
Well, it's not as bad as the United States, that's for sure. Because like when I was doing my master's and recently completed my doctorate degree, like a lot of my research stemmed on neck pain and cervical spine issues, and like the predominance and the reliance on pharmaceutical and opioid drugs. And there's now recently in the last 5 to 10 years been a shift more towards exercise therapy and relating exercise therapy towards like rehabilitation than always like injections and pharmaceuticals and opioids, which are just like obscuring and masking the issue and disguising the issue, and like doing absolutely nothing for it. And actually like then again going back to exercise therapy, like suggesting something like that actually strengthens the cervical spine and corrects the alignment and corrects poor posture, because it's very recently that posture is coming into play as an issue that's leading to SCI as well.
Yeah, there's a whole host of reasons, and again, acute management of spinal cord injury has changed considerably since I was there. There is some early preclinical evidence to show that managing pain in the acute phase can help lead to improved outcomes, but again, it's still early days. But yeah, I think rapid mobilization, getting people up and moving, is becoming more and more common. I think back in the olden days, they thought that stabilization and mobilization was a better option. But I'm not an expert in acute clinical practice, but we'll maybe jump off of that question for now. We're running a little long here, so maybe I'll let one more question to the panel here, so we can jump into breakout rooms in about 5 minutes time. Durga Chandrupatla.
Hi, John. Yeah.
Hi, Durga.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah. I'm interested in understanding your perspective about the bowel stimulation. I think that is one of the main concerns with many spinal cord injury patients about bowel movement. And what I've already seen in the market is that there are not really good devices which are user-friendly for the patient, or in the clinic or tertiary care, they have digital, stimulation. So if you could throw a light on that prospect about electrical stimulation for bowel movement, that would be great.
Yeah. Sure, I can take care of this one real quick, Durga. Yeah, so the most common methodologies for people with spinal cord injury, as I said, is laxative suppositories, digital stimulation, or irrigation to empty their bowels. But yeah, there is some great innovation happening in nerve stimulation. So probably the two most common ones that we're looking at is either sacral nerve root stimulation. So that's an implanted stimulator that's touching on the sacral nerve roots and inducing bowel contraction. And again, there is evidence to show there is I think, a couple of devices that have come to market. The challenge with these is that they haven't been readily accepted by the community, whether that's because people aren't aware of them, or whether it's an issue with reimbursement costs or things along those lines. But I do know some researchers in Cleveland have been moving quite deep into that. And we took part in a survey with the North American SCI Consortium, looking at priorities for individuals with spinal cord injury around these sort of innovative new devices. So if you're interested, I can certainly send you some more information on that. Another area we're looking at is transcutaneous spinal cord stimulation, or epidural spinal cord stimulation, which Ilya was asking about earlier in the chat. For those that are unfamiliar, spinal cord stimulation is either electrical or magnetic stimulation of the actual spinal cord. It was used traditionally in pain management for people with back pain syndrome, chronic back pain syndrome. They found that using it in a certain different modality works for enhancing motor and autonomic recovery of persons with spinal cord injury, including bowel and bladder function. Again, it's still in the clinical testing area. It's not been approved for clinical application as of yet, but it can be done either invasively through an epidural stimulator array or non-invasively through transcutaneous electrical or magnetic stimulator. So definitely a very interesting area of research, Durga, and something we're very much keeping abreast of. But yeah, I don't know how much more depth I can go into at this point on that.
No, I just want to mention one point, John, is that I had earlier worked on a project for traumatic brain injury, and I've seen some devices where they use very little amount of electrical current on a continuous basis to stimulate and help the patient. So I was thinking how I can transition that idea to spinal cord injury.
So, Durga, are you talking about transcranial stimulation, or are you talking about deep brain stimulation, or are you talking about spinal cord stimulation or peripheral nerve stimulation?
The first and last one, the peripheral and the transcranial.
Transcranial. Yeah, there is some evidence in that area. I'm by no means an expert, but we could certainly maybe get a little deeper into that as we move into the breakout rooms. Maybe whoever's in charge of breakout rooms, if maybe you can make sure Durga gets into whichever one I'm going to be facilitating, and maybe we can go into a bit more depth around that. But there is some work that's being done in transcranial stimulation as well as peripheral and sacral nerve root. I don't know if we have time to go into too much depth right now, because I think we need to jump into breakout rooms, but definitely an area of innovation that's exciting for people with spinal cord injury.
So I want to thank the three of you for starting up our conversation, but I do want to give people an opportunity to jump into the smaller groups to ask their own questions. I've put some guiding questions which you may or may not choose to explore. As you get into the smaller rooms, it's your opportunity to discuss what you know about spinal cord injuries, what questions you have to discover, and what to ask. So if we're ready, Julia, without further ado, we'll start putting ourselves into the smaller rooms where we can discuss the stuff that you've heard, as well as ask questions or share your ideas. We'll do this for about 20 minutes. So at about 4:45, we'll come back and we'll just do a very quick Q&A about some of the things upcoming in the challenge thereafter.
All right, and before we jump into those groups, I just want to say that these facilitators are experts in living with spinal cord injury. They are not experts in the challenge. So if you have any questions about how the challenge actually operates, save those for Joseph. But use this time to share your ideas about this innovative challenge, what you'd like to bring forth, and ask more questions about spinal cord injury to these experts.
And we're going to start. Everyone's going to start being placed in breakout rooms. I'm sure.
Sorry, I'm just checking facilitators here.
So feel free, those of you that have any questions about the challenge, to send them to ideation@utoronto.ca, or to check out the website ideation.clinic, where it has more guides and explanations. As we move forward, we're making the site better and more robust with more resources and things for you. As a pilot, we're learning as we go and iterating, so keep checking back, and if there's something that you're uncertain of or want to see, please feel free to contact us. We are looking for continuous and ongoing feedback so that we can make this a good and productive experience, and that we can make it useful for people. So there are different people, different stages of innovation here. So we're trying to make a broad attempt to help as many people as we can. When you submit your 2-minute video pitches that are due April 5th, we will use those as a kind of triage to look at what kind of resources, mentorship, support we can provide for you and your ideas, where you're at, and how we can work with you to move your ideas forward. Also, if you have ideas that are a little more developed or want to get more feedback on from expert judges, you can submit a concept pitch. The form is the same. You just have to pick which areas you want to submit for. We'll review and discuss with you. There is an award to incentivize video submissions, but the real value is the mentorship and the support we can provide through the coming months to get you in front of potential investors, supporters, angels, and organizations that could help with further development of your concepts and ideas.